Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people online. We also have James Baxter currently as an attendee rather than a panelist. I've tried to promote you, James. You've declined to be promoted to a panelist, so that makes life a little bit difficult. Are you there, James?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you see me?
We can't see you. You're only as an attendee at the moment, and I've pressed promote to panelist.
Join as a, sorry, the dial. Does that work?
Let's have a look. You are now a panelist. That is great.
Camera, if I can.
I'm sorry. I know it's so early in the morning there for you.
Oh, it's not too bad.
Wonderful. We have you in the flesh. Superb. Thank you. So we'll get going. Welcome to this webinar on, well, coming to you partly from Canberra and partly from Geneva. The topic for the webinar today is basically an update on what's going on in the WTO. So welcome. The host for this webinar obviously is the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. My name is Prue Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre. And we have with us, very fortunate to have with us, Mr. James Baxter, who is Australia's Ambassador to the WTO. Part of the reason why we thought this was such an important webinar to put on is because there is so much going on in the WTO at the moment. There are so many discussions across so many topics. It can be difficult for an Australian business or for even, I think, to some extent, Australian policymakers that sit outside the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to know what the priority issues are Australia is pursuing in the WTO and to get updates on how those issues are being progressed. So James so kindly agreed to do the webinar. We're going to make it a part of an ongoing series of webinars and information resources on the WTO with and without the mission in Geneva. James has got up at 7:30 in the morning, so we're super grateful. You look relatively fresh, which is great. But I thought I would just hand over to you, James, to just give us some insights into what's going on over there in Geneva, how discussions are tracking, and what the priority issues are that Australia's progressing there.
Great. So I will chat for a few minutes on those questions, and then happy to take any questions. But really want to thank you, Prue, for giving us the opportunity to talk to people in Australia directly about what's going on in the WTO. It's an organisation where developments have flown under the radar for many years now, but it is something where governments still talk to each other about things that do matter, do affect our economic policies, and even a bit more broadly, as I'll come to, our policies in areas like sustainability. Occasionally they even reach agreement on new rules. So perhaps if I can just say as well that WTO operates according to European time. So we are just at the end of what you could say is the school year, and it's been a big final week, and then the WTO will go into a summer recess and we'll be back in September. But we've had a number of discussions, and I might focus really at the moment on the negotiation of new rules, because there's been quite a lot happening in that area. And I'll talk in particular about three initiatives. One is on an agreement on fisheries subsidies. One is on an agreement on investment facilitation. And one is on an agreement on electronic commerce. So if I can start with the fisheries subsidies agreement, and just for a bit of background for participants, although I can see from the participants a lot of you will know this background. The fisheries subsidies agreement is one that's been under negotiation for a couple of decades. It's actually part of the Doha round that was launched in the early 2000s, and effectively died 7 or 8 years after it did produce the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And the fisheries subsidies negotiations are really probably the second element that will come out of that Doha round agenda. And it was, so it's a multilateral agreement being negotiated among all WTO members. Some of you will be aware that the first wave, as we call it, of the fisheries subsidies negotiations was actually concluded in 2022 in the margins of the 12th Ministerial Conference in Geneva. That addressed, well, when I say addressed, that imposed a prohibition on a number of government programs, effectively meaning that governments will no longer be allowed to subsidise fishing that contributes to illegal, unreported or unregulated fishing. So really, that was a very basic discipline. You'd say they're the sorts of things that government should not be subsidising, but there were no rules preventing governments actually paying their industries to undertake that sort of activity. Now there are. As part of that agreement, well, the way that agreement was done is those provisions were extracted out from a broader agenda where there was more work to be done. So that agreement was negotiated in, as I say, concluded in 2022. It requires 2/3 of the WTO membership to ratify it before it comes into force. That's going to be 111 members. We now have about 80. I think we're around 80 who have ratified, so we're not far away. And the Director General, who has been really pressing governments to get on to ratifying the agreement, she's very confident that it will come into force by the end of the year, which would be a very good thing. But there was another agenda that members agreed in 2022 they would pursue through negotiation of additional rules, and their rules on subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. So this again is really to sit alongside, expand the scope of the agreement and to take it towards achieving one of the sustainable development goals that was agreed in the UN to be achieved by 2030, and specifically on sustainable fisheries. So that's it's a much more ambitious set of rules, because this is rules that actually go to limiting the amount that governments can pay for programs to their fishing industries that they actually do have in place at the moment. So big subsidizers like the EU, Japan, some of the other North Asians do pay money to their fishing industries to undertake some of the activities that are going to be covered by this agreement, and in fact are going to be constrained by this agreement. So it's been a more difficult one to get to agreement on. But we had a discussion about it among all WTO members earlier this week that followed quite an intensive set of negotiations late last year and then again in recent weeks. And we are very close as membership to agreement on these additional rules. We have a text that is close to final that nearly all members can agree to. And we, who have been very strong supporters of this agreement in Australia from a sustainability point of view, are very hopeful that it will be concluded shortly after the resumption of WTO work in September. There is a big question mark, and that relates to India, which has some very substantial reservations about the approach that's been taken in the text, and it reiterated those reservations in some detail in discussions earlier this week in the WTO. So that's something that the membership is going to have to work on. They are a big member, and they have demonstrated in the past that they are happy to stand out against the rest of the membership if they are not happy with an agreement. And the WTO, as those who are on this webinar will know, operates on the basis of consensus. So something will have to be done to bridge the gap between India and the rest of the membership. But we are very hopeful that that will be something that can be resolved in the coming months. It would, as I say, have done, sit alongside the initial fisheries subsidies agreement to create a more comprehensive set of rules. And that would be the first WTO agreement, really, that's got a substantial sustainability angle as well as a trade angle. So quite an achievement for the organisation. It's taken a long time. It doesn't go as far in disciplining subsidies as some members would like, particularly Pacific members in our region who obviously have very strong interests in preserving their fisheries stocks, but it's a good first step. So that's
can I ask James, just in terms of the fisheries commitments, that is quite a big commitment that a lot of countries will be making. I just keep thinking of French and English fishermen blocking harbours and doing all sorts of things when they feel that policy isn't going their way. So will the new additional part of the agreement include or require complete removal of subsidy programs, or will it be phased in over time? Can you get into that kind of detail?
So it certainly won't. It certainly will not stop government subsidising fishing. But the point is that for the big subsidisers, and here you're right about the European member states, but also, you know, there's the North Asians and also China, of course. What it will do is require them, and there's a sort of the approach is there's a list of activities that or types of fishing that they won't be able to undertake, and if they do want to undertake these activities, they're going to have to demonstrate that the way they're going to do them is not unsustainable, effectively. So, and we know from our discussions with WTO members, some of these big industrial subsidisers, that they are going to have to change their programs, and they're not very comfortable about it, actually. They've been kind of pulled over the line by the weight of the membership. Interestingly, mostly smaller members who want to keep fishery stocks, but also the United States has long had an interest in promoting sustainable fish stocks globally. So it's been really pulling in that direction as well. So it certainly, governments will be able to continue to subsidise their fishing industries, but they will not be able to do it in a way that contributes to overcapacity and overfishing. And that is going to be a big shift.
That would be a major outcome. Big tip.
It would be. It would be. I mean, you know, one of the other things that it does, and this is really where the more traditional WTO angle fits in, is there is a very strong sense that a small number of countries have developed fishing industries, global fishing industries that have depleted fish stocks, and that effectively crowd out the capacity of other countries to develop any sort of economically viable fishing industry. So part of this as well is about constraining those big fishing countries in particular, and the focus is on them, and that the idea being that would allow smaller developing countries to develop their fishing industries in a way that allowed it to contribute to their economic development. That's much more in line, as I say, with the traditional WTO ethos.
Fantastic.
But that sustainability dimension is new and important. So that's the first one. Now, one of the things I mentioned in talking about that was that we had to get consensus among the membership, because it's a multilateral agreement and even one member can block. And again, participants in this webinar will know that that's been one of the big frustrations with the WTO and developing new rules, really for a long time now. So what a number of members have done over recent years is launch negotiations among a subset of interested WTO members. And we call those plurilateral negotiations. And there's been one that's already been agreed and has effectively entered into force for most of the participants. That's on services domestic regulation, which is about transparency, facilitation of services trade. The second one in chronological order is on investment facilitation, and it's actually called an agreement on investment facilitation for development. This agreement these negotiations were launched back in 2017 and were concluded in substance about 18 months ago. Since then, the participants, and there are now 125 out of 160 or so WTO members, have been looking to incorporate that agreement into the WTO framework of rules. So it's a plurilateral agreement among 125 members, but in order to get a decision to incorporate it into the WTO framework of rules, you need consensus. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the focus has been on really preparing or expanding the membership. So a lot of developing countries have now joined up, and they've joined up because they think the agreement will promote foreign investment in their economies, and it will do that through provisions that require greater transparency, greater consultation in rulemaking, things like explanation of decisions on the part of government agencies, the sort of thing that in Australia we routinely do anyway, but that is not something that necessarily is a characteristic of a lot of developing country governments. And so the thinking is that if governments sign on to these provisions and implement them, then foreign investors looking at investment opportunities will be more likely to look at those countries because they know that their investments will get a certain level of treatment, and there'll be that level of certainty and predictability that will provide greater confidence to investors to go and invest in those economies. So it's really a very popular agreement, as I say, for a plurilateral agreement. 125 members from right across the world, including members who are not very active in the WTO at all, are really interested in this agreement. So that's been something that's built out now to a very broad swathe of the membership, and in parallel, the members have been working on a formal document that basically asks the WTO for a decision to incorporate it in the WTO framework. If that happens, then it becomes like some other agreements in the WTO. The government procurement agreement is one where not all members participate, but it's still part of the WTO. Members can get together and have meetings in the WTO building. It's got all the secretariat support for that, and importantly, WTO dispute settlement provisions apply to it. So that's what we have been seeking. Now, there are some members of the WTO who are not favourably inclined to plurilateral agreements, and notably they're India and South Africa, and their view is that plurilateral agreements effectively are not in line with the idea that the WTO is a global framework that operates on a multilateral basis. So their view is these plurilateral agreements have been developed without reference to the views of the entire membership. Therefore, they don't really want to see them incorporated in the WTO framework of rules, even though, as I said, there are plurilateral agreements already in the WTO and long have been. So we had a discussion about that among all the members at the General Council, which is the meeting of WTO ambassadors earlier this week. Very strong interest in, very strong support for incorporating that agreement into the WTO framework. The formal decision was put to members for consideration, but India and a couple of other members, South Africa, Turkey, blocked it. So it wasn't agreed. The strongest reservations were on the part of India, which argues not only is it concerned about the plurilateral dimension of it, but it also didn't argue this so strongly this week, that because the agreement is about investment, it doesn't really belong in the WTO, which it says should be about trade. So that's been blocked. Now, Chile and Korea, who are coordinating this project on behalf of the 125 members, we'll go into consultations with the membership of the group after the summer. And then we'll have some consultations with India. We will see whether we can overcome, it's not just India, South Africa, Turkey. We'll see whether we can overcome the reservations to that. We don't know whether we can, to be honest. And I think one of the big questions that the membership's going to have to ask if we can't is, what do you do with an agreement that you've basically completely negotiated? You're all ready to have it binding on everyone, including with dispute settlement provisions, and then you get stuck. Are 125 members really going to just walk away from that? Don't know. But that will be one of the interesting questions that members are going to have to grapple with. So the third agreement is also a plurilateral agreement, and it was launched formally at the same time as the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement back in 2017, but negotiations really only started 5 years ago, and that's the agreement on e-commerce. And that's also, so there are about 70 members originally participated in that. Then by this year, we got up to about 90 participants, including most major economies, not India, unsurprisingly. That agreement will deal with a wide range of issues that are designed to promote and facilitate digital trade, so e-payments, e-invoicing, things like consumer protection as well, a whole range of provisions on how governments should regulate the way that businesses and consumers should deal with each other on digital trade. Very importantly as well, that agreement also contains a provision requiring governments not to impose any customs duties on electronic transmissions, so on digital trade effectively. And this is a rule that has long had provenance in the WTO. It's been negotiated multilaterally since 1998, but only ever on a temporary basis, generally from one ministerial conference to the next. So every 2 years, it has to be actively rolled over. What this agreement will do is say, we're going to forget that approach. We're just going to agree to do it permanently. And that's a big step forward, because every ministerial conference we get to, there are questions about whether it should be rolled over, the moratorium should be rolled over permanently. One of the very important set of issues that will not be covered in this e-commerce agreement, at least in the first phase, relates to management of data and data flows. So this is an area that's typically covered in free trade agreement chapters on electronic commerce, something that we in Australia like to have in electronic agreements on electronic commerce. It just provides certainty for the way businesses can manage their data, which is an important aspect, of course, of digital trade. That's not going to be in the first phase of the agreement, largely because the sentiment of some major players about the management of data is shifting. So traditionally, for example, the United States wanted very strong rules, essentially restricting governments from controlling data flows to be included in these agreements. But the US administration has taken an approach to digital trade, I think, that is one that revisits some of the positions that have been taken in the past, largely questioning, not drawing a conclusion, but questioning whether they've got the balance right between the interests of big tech and the interests of smaller businesses and consumers. And because major economies are looking at the balance of some of those rules, the membership largely agreed late last year that now was not the time to try to come to a binding agreement among all members. We let things settle a bit and come back to that. So we basically agreed late last year that we would put those rules on hold and come back to them. But we will come back to them In the meantime, though, we decided, oh, sorry, go ahead. I can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Good Lord, I was on mute. Just on the US shift in position, have they given any indication on when they might feel that they've had enough time to review that position and come back with either continue to support what they were saying before or come up with new proposals?
Look, they haven't, and now effectively, we're quite confident it won't happen before the election. So obviously, where the US administration will come out would not be something that will be determined until 2025, and that's really why I think the membership decided to harvest what we could now, because we really weren't sure how long it would take before we could even start a negotiation on those issues, let alone conclude one. So the the exciting news is that we have a final agreement, and the very exciting news is that it will be going public. In fact, it might be public now. It's literally going public this morning.
Breaking news. Awesome.
Yeah. So that the members have agreed on the text of an agreement among themselves, and we did that. We finalised the text that's going to be available on the WTO website. We finalised that about a month ago. Since then, participants have been consulting their governments directly internally about whether they're actually able to proceed to formalisation of that agreement. Unsurprisingly, a number of governments have got through that process, but a number still have not. So although there are about 90 participants in the agreement, we expect that there will be, the number. We won't get to that number again for several months as governments go through their domestic consultation process. But we do have a final agreement. We have a number of governments who want to move ahead on the basis of the text of this agreement to the next stage of discussions, which is really locking in finally that text and alongside in a way that puts it in the position that the investment facilitation agreement is in, which has a decision on top of it saying we want to incorporate this into the WTO framework of rules. So that's work that the participants will take up again after the summer. But it's a really big outcome. This will be the first set of substantial rules on digital trade globally ever, which is a pretty big deal. As I say, it hasn't got everything that we would want in there or that many others would want in there, but we're very confident now we have this in place, and we have a mass of the membership behind this initiative that we will be able to build on this over time, and that's a very considerable step forward for the organisation.
That's great. Thank you so much for the update on those three. And I guess how the membership, if they ultimately do incorporate the investment facilitation agreement for development, that might provide a model for how we implement these other plurilaterals, including the e-commerce agreement.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. That with these two plurilateral agreements now at the stage they're at, those of us who want to be developing new rules, including on a plurilateral basis, are really going to have to address how to overcome any blockages there may be in getting those rules incorporated into the WTO framework. It's not a straightforward question, but it's one that there's, I think a lot of political impetus behind.
Great. I should just say to those online, if you'd like to ask any questions, please put them in the Q&A. A couple of people weren't able to join us live, but they actually sent me an incredibly long list of questions that they wanted me to ask you. And some of them are quite full on, so I'm moderating those questions. But if anyone online wants to ask a question, please enter them in the Q&A. Just something I wanted to raise with you. So I understand the review of China's trade policies is currently underway. I think, did I hear correctly in hearing that there was something like thousands and thousands of questions put to the Chinese about a whole range of their different trade policies. Is that right?
So it was actually conducted last week. Yeah, so this was the ninth time that members have reviewed China's trade policy, and the first in 3 years. I think it's 2021. So yeah, they got about 1,500 questions from members, which is a large number. I mean, the largest members do tend to get over 1,000 questions. It's not unprecedented, but it does show a very strong level of interest across the spectrum on China's trade policies, and that that reflects the fact that it's the as a country it trades more in goods than any other country in the world, and it's the #1 trading partner for I don't know how many governments it is now, but countries it is now, but it's dozens and dozens and dozens, of course, throughout our region, but also elsewhere. So a lot of questioning to China. Yeah.
Did Australia put any questions to China, or do we sort of raise them regularly outside that process?
No, we certainly, I mean, we do both, obviously, but we certainly did. We put, my recollection, it was something in the order of 70 questions to China. So quite a large number. I think there's a maximum of 75 that any member can put to in a TPR, and we might have gone pretty close to that. Yeah, so we put a lot of questions to China on very, they range from very specific questions about how how establishments for can be approved for exports to China in relation to things like meat, to really systemic questions about how the Chinese system operates in ways that may contribute to overcapacity. And that was certainly one of the big themes that came out of the TPR.
I do have a question which actually goes to one that I was going to ask as well, and that's just how is the dispute settlement process working? Because I see that disputes are still being brought to panels, even if they don't have an appellate body to go to after a dispute's been resolved or concluded. And how is dispute settlement reform discussions progressing?
That's a great question. So maybe if I can get two parts. First of all, you're right. Proved disputes are still continuing. Countries are still challenging each other. Importantly, China has recently requested a panel be formed to consider the compliance of the US Inflation Reduction Act with WTO rules. That'll be considered actually by the dispute settlement body today. And then South Africa, I think, has a couple of disputes it's launched against the European Union on horticultural products, where a panel will be established today. So countries are still using the dispute settlement system. That they can still be resolved in different ways. So, of course, you can decide if you get a panel report, simply to adopt the panel report and not to appeal it. So in China's recent dispute against Australia on certain anti-dumping duties on steel products, we decided not to appeal the panel report. So it was adopted. So it's now legally binding, and we're in the implementation phase of that. In other cases, countries can use what's called an interim arrangement, the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, or MPIA, which is operative among about 40 WTO members, and that effectively means those parties use it in lieu of the appellate body, and that's been used only in one case between Colombia and the European Union. But the fact that it's there, I think, provides a basis for countries to think about, how they're going to manage their disputes, and for a country which loses at the panel stage to consider, do I want to just implement, because I know I can't escape. A binding ruling because I'm a member of this arrangement. For the rest of the members, though, there is a question, because And what we're typically seeing is, very often seeing, is a country that loses or where a panel loses a dispute where a panel finds that its measures are not in compliance with the WTO agreement, does, if it's not a member of the MPIA, have the capacity to appeal to the appellate body, knowing that there is no appellate body to consider it. So that's appealing into the void, and then the country is not required to comply. We are seeing that happen still. So that's an issue, but it has not led to complete paralysis of the system by any means. Then because it is still an issue, we are working very hard. The membership's working very hard to restore the system. Ministers agreed in MC13 that they would accelerate efforts to doing that with a view to having the system back up and running by the end of this year. There are discussions going on at experts level and ambassador level formally now since MC13. There were informal discussions before that. The main issues that have been identified for consideration, one on what to do about the appellate body, where there's a big divergence of views from what I would say the membership on the one hand and the United States on the other. Although actually, interestingly, in discussions, a lot of members have come to acknowledge that reforms to the way an appeal mechanism might work are needed, and when we're among those. So it's not quite as stark as it was, but there's still a fairly wide divergence of views between the United States and most of the rest of the membership. The second issue that ministers identified as being important to be taken up was accessibility, and what we mean by that is whether the system is actually usable, in particular by small WTO members. There's a sense that WTO formal dispute settlement procedures are expensive and time-consuming, and therefore not really something that smaller, poorer economies can make practical use of. So there are discussions going on that issue as well, about whether there are things that can be done to make the system more accessible. Those discussions, there's definitely a lot of areas of convergence in them, but there are some big areas of difference as well. And getting through all of those by the end of 2024. Considering where we are in some political cycles, that does seem a pretty ambitious timeframe to me at the moment.
And I imagine you and Geneva aren't immune from the wall-to-wall coverage of the amazing things happening in relation to the US election. I think some will say that the possibility of a second Trump presidency, or actually even continuation of current US policy, may not bode that well for the future of the WTO. I mean, some have posited that Donald Trump might take the US out of the WTO. And I know discussions on issues like reappointment or appointment of the new Director General or existing Director General, that there's been a request to speed up that process, and some have made drawn the conclusion that that's because they want to get it done before the US election and a possible second Trump presidency. Are you seeing any other, I guess, impacts on discussions in the WTO that are, I guess, anticipating a second Trump presidency? It's a bit difficult to say.
Look, I wouldn't really, Prue. I mean, I think, obviously everyone is entitled to draw their own views about, to form their own views about what might happen in the US, and you, of course, much better place to make judgments about those things than I am. The first Trump presidency, and was certainly a shock to the organisation, in particular the decision to effectively block the appellate body was one of major significance. But the reality is that the Biden administration has continued the policy of keeping the appellate body in the freezer effectively. And so there's not necessarily a lot of partisanship in US positions. And certainly everything we hear from the US when it comes to the dispute settlement system is that the concerns the US expresses are shared across the board within the US. So I don't think that the US position on that issue, which is a really major issue for WTO members, is one that is going to be affected particularly, certainly over the period in the lead up to the election by that. You raised the question of the Director General's reappointment, which the African Group did propose earlier this week, be expedited. I mean, people can speculate on why that's come forward. The African Group put forward an explanation in its proposal to members that linked it to the fact that the next ministerial conference will be held in Africa, in Cameroon, actually, at the beginning of 2026. And that if you allowed the decision-making process for the reappointment of the Director General or the appointment of a new Director General to take place in its normal timeframe, that would mean that the next term of the Director General would start on the 1st of September. And in the lead up to that, you would have potentially a long period of discussion about who should be the next Director General. And that would be the reality is that would be a very considerable distraction from work. So I think the view of the African Group is let's clear the decks and let next year be about preparing for the ministerial conference, because we know it takes a long time to get things ready for ministerial conferences. So let's get this Director General thing out of the way earlier, if possible, this year, and then if it's the current Director General who's reappointed, then we all know where we stand and we can just focus solely on the preparations for the ministerial conference. For us, that there's a lot of logic to that, particularly because we very strongly think that the current Director General is doing a very good job. So we're not really looking at it in any other light than that.
Sounds sensible. Two questions I got, which I'll combine into one, and that is basically, are there any discussions going on market access in goods or services anywhere in the WTO?
Oh no, you're talking about negotiation of market access.
Yes.
Yeah, so what would I say? What should I say here? So perhaps brings me to a topic that I haven't talked about yet, but which is an Australian I really should have talked about, and I can even hold up to the camera my little Cairns Group member badge, and that's agriculture. So one of the areas where we are having discussions, continuing long-standing discussions on new rules, is on agriculture. It's an area where the membership, as people would know, has not really made any steps forward since, well, in 10 years now, since there was a decision to eliminate export subsidies, a really important decision at the time. Since then, though, members have been talking about a range of reforms that could be made to agricultural trade rules, and they're focused mostly on subsidies, domestic support, trade distorting domestic support, and also on food security, how WTO rules on agriculture could promote food security. But a number of members have, in that context, raised their interest in having negotiations on improving market access on agricultural products. And so there certainly are discussions going on in that forum about market access. It's, like all of agriculture, very sensitive. particularly for the European Union, but also for a number of other countries. But it is something that members have raised. So we are hoping that there will be an agreement by the next ministerial conference in Cameroon in 2026, some substantial step forward on agriculture. We think the fact that African countries are very interested in agricultural reform and they're host of the conference, and a lot of their interest is in really basic stuff like livelihood, subsistence farming, that they've got a lot of moral authority to press resistant members hard to agree to reforms on agriculture. So that's work that we will be doing, and market access may figure in that. In fact, I think it's quite likely that if we're able to come to an outcome, market access will have to figure in some way, just listening to what major members around the room are saying. In terms of other areas, there are no active negotiations on market access at the moment, but there are ideas in various areas that members are considering, but it's really at a very preliminary stage.
Another question was, is there anything Australian business can do to support what you're doing and to help promote the importance of free trade in Australia?
Yeah, so there are things that we can do, and it would be really welcome if this were done. And it's just in discussions among themselves and with governments and their counterparts overseas, if they can just be saying that the WTO framework of rules is something that they really value, that it's really important for them to be able to trade when they're seeking to trade globally, in particular, that those rules are there, that they're binding, that they're enforceable. And for Australia, they are in many countries because we are part of this MPIA. That's really valuable, because the problem that we do face in the WTO is, one of the problems that we face is that it's seen as, it can be seen as dated, and that's because people don't recognise that in fact new rules have been agreed recently in a number of areas. They still tend to associate the WTO with the failure of the Doha round, and that's a great shame. So I think that they can do that. Then when it comes to something like e-commerce, which is, the first global agreement on digital trade, okay, in 2024, it may be a bit later than businesses would have liked it, but it's a really good occasion to come out and say, this is important to us, this means something to us. We now have certainty among a significant group of members, or once it's entered into force, but you can be saying it now. We now have certainty that these countries won't impose customs duties on digital trade, and that's going to be really important for big businesses as well as small businesses, individual business people, that they know that they're going to be able to trade both import for inputs to their businesses, but also export freely. That's something that's really significant, and I think it's important that we record those moments and their significance and value.
I agree. ACITI agrees wholeheartedly. James, will be doing our little bit. I have another question, which will be the last, unless anyone else has another question online. And that goes to, I guess, related to environmental issues under discussion in the WTO, but also the consistency of a lot of environmental measures that countries are introducing with some of your fundamental WTO provisions and rules. And I guess, is that a live discussion in the WTO, or are members really being quite lenient in terms of giving countries introducing measures to meet climate change goals or other environmental goals, being quite lenient in terms of letting those measures roll out, even if they're impacting on trade?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is a topic that is is being taken up in with quite a bit of energy in the WTO in different ways, and mainly the way it has been taken up today is when measures are announced by governments individually, other members will tend to challenge them. So the one that has been the most discussed is the Europeans' carbon border adjustment mechanism, where a lot of countries have really right across the spectrum of the WTO have been questioning the EU since the time it announced that it would be implementing the mechanism, about how it's going to work, the extent to which it's going to meet the objectives, the extent to which it's going to affect trading interests in other governments. It's been a very active discussion. Some are taking the view, as you characterised it, of acknowledging the importance of the objective of the European Union in this area. And I think, I could put Australia into that category, but still saying, we have strong interests in how this is being implemented, and we do want to make sure that businesses aren't being affected unduly. So, by in particular by the design of the measures. Others are being really much stronger in their contestation of the measure, saying we don't accept that, for example, under the Paris Agreement, it's right for the European Union effectively to impose an additional price on our exports to the European Union just because we don't have a carbon price. And the Paris Agreement allows us to pursue emissions efforts at the level we decide and in the way we decide. And effectively, the European Union is now saying, if you don't do it the way we've done it through a carbon price, you're going to have your products are going to have to pay a penalty. So there are very strong contestation of that. The European Union's deforestation regulation, another one that's been very strongly resisted by countries, including countries in our region. So typically, the issue is being dealt with as measures come up. But there is a discussion starting about whether that is actually an effective way to deal with the issue or not. And it's a discussion, I think, that is of interest both to those who feel that they may be disadvantaged by what they call unilateral measures, as well as, to give it credit, by the EU, which says, on the one hand, we, and indeed all WTO members, have obligations, possibly, or if not obligations under international treaties, an interest in pursuing environmental objectives. We want to be able to do that. We want to be able to talk to members about how to do that in a way that doesn't unduly affect trade interests. So can we do that in the WTO? That is a discussion that is really beginning to take off at a more structural level. And we've had some very good discussions in the Committee on the Trade and Environment over the last year, and in the margins of it, there's an informal parallel group of WTO members who go a bit further than the Committee on Trade and Environment. So it is something that I think will continue to grow. Again, it's an area where agricultural exporting countries have a particular interest as well, because so many of the measures that we're talking about potentially have an effect on agricultural trade.
It would be great to have some guidelines even for countries to use when they're designing these measures. I mean, even Australia's, some components of Australia's Future Made in Australia programs around the hydrogen production incentive and the solar sunshot program raise some questions, I think, for some people in terms of whether they're 100% consistent with Australia's obligations under the WTO. But having some clear guidelines on how you design these measures in a way that supports and is consistent with the WTO rules would be super helpful.
Yeah, so I think, speaking personally here, I think that this is an area where the WTO has to step up. Members members need to be able to design and implement measures aimed at promoting sustainability. That's unquestionable in a whole range of areas. But they need to be able to do it in a way that doesn't unduly affect trade and economic interests of other governments. The WTO needs to be able to help bring us together and talk about the sort of things you're talking about. You know, is it principles, is it guidelines about how you do it? Are there dialogues you can set up to allow these things to happen in a way that's not unduly distortive of trade?
Absolutely, and such a key contribution the WTO makes, just those discussions and nutting through. And yes, outcomes are so important, and I think the three that you've talked about will demonstrate that the WTO can kick goals, as we like to say, it can deliver, but the discussions themselves are just so critically important. So thank you so much again. I know it's Friday morning there, very early. We really appreciate this update. As I said, ACITI will continue to put out information on what's happening in the WTO. That will be either with the mission or without the mission. We'll just be putting it out as it comes through, just to try and make it easy for Australian business and policy makers outside DFAT to easily get a handle on what's happening in the WTO and a sense of the important discussions that are going on there. So, James, thank you so much. I hope after today you get a good weekend, and I hope you get a bit of a summer break there in the Northern Hemisphere.
Thank you very much, Prue, and really a big thank you to you for putting this on. The WTO, obviously I'm biased, but I think the WTO delivers a lot for Australia, but getting some information out to people about what's happening here and what it's delivering on a regular basis is a really important contribution to, I think, maintaining Australia's interests and promoting Australia's interests directly. So thank you, and thanks to everyone who's dialed in.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, Prue.
Thanks, James.